civilian and combatant deaths as a result of the 20-year war between the Peruvian armed forces, the Peruvian Communist Party Shining Path, and the Movimiento Revolucionario Tupac Amaru. Such a figure, the TRC concluded in its final report, meant that Peru had suffered more deaths during this 20-year period than in all the wars fought since independence from colonial rule in 1821. More disturbingly, since the TRC's new figures nearly double prior estimates of 35,000 deaths and disappearances, Lerner was led to ask how so many deaths could have gone not only unaccounted for, but also unnoticed, to the point that there was not even any remembrance of them. That such mass death should have gone unnoticed and unremembered demonstrated, as Lerner put it, that exclusion in Peru was so absolute that it was possible for tens of thousands of citizens to disappear without anyone in broader society even noticing. Beyond the revelation of the magnitude of the violence that affected mostly Quechua-speaking people in rural Peru, as well as the moral indifference of mainstream Peruvians towards the suffering of their less fortunate fellow nationals, the event of truth was in itself remarkable. In more than 20 years of internal war, no official attempt had been made before to speak to mainstream Peruvians with such frankness about past violence and atrocity. Unsurprisingly, the TRC's findings were not widely accepted and in some cases were outright negated by powerful conservative sectors. Over the last 10 years, successive governments have, for the most part, ignored the TRC's findings and recommendations, while human rights groups and other liberal sectors have claimed its final report as their own. Since then, every year, the anniversary of the release of the TRC's final report is celebrated in Lima and other regions of Peru through a series of commemorative acts. This annual commemoration suggests that the TRC's final report stands as its most ambitious, comprehensive, and lasting legacy. We can safely say, then, that the object of annual commemoration is the birth of a text. Certainly not an ordinary text, but one that reveals to Peruvians the truth of violence and massive suffering caused by such a violence. The question I would like to explore in this paper is how such displacement from embodied suffering to the text of suffering occurs and what implications it has for the struggle against state terror. I suggest some initial thoughts about this by following Foucault's conceptual distinction between the problems of truth and truth-telling. While the former pertains to the analysis of criteria that enables anyone to recognize whether a statement or proposition is true or not, the latter pertains to the real of a specific activity, role, or more precisely, function. The argument I want to pursue here is that this distinction is even more necessary in relation to the problem of violence, insofar as there tends to be a slippage between truth-making and truth-telling. Furthermore, by definition, an official truth needs to be packaged in majoritarian forms of language and thought, whereas truth-telling is always a minoritarian function. Allow me to start by first reflecting upon the commemoration of the final report itself, of the birth of the text. The emphasis on the final report evidences first the work of a long-standing cultural form that connects the written text with the political community. Historians have long demonstrated how the invention of writing is intimately bound up with the development of the city and the subsequent need of a public realm. Without reasonably well-developed systems of writing, human societies would not have been able to manage large populations. Writing made possible to refine the art of public address and introduce new forms of education, such as the art of rhetoric. It has been also associated to the development of earlier forms of democracy. My point here is that any discussion of a written text, such as the TRC's final report, needs to be situated within broader genealogies of writing practices, imagining community and state formation. Such text is a form of public address that presupposes an audience, is delivered through particular rhetoric, and comes into being through particular technologies of truth. A second element, the emphasis on the final report manifests, is that it embodies a truth with symbolic capital. Practices of truth-telling about violence and massive suffering existed before the inception of the TRC. Suffices to mention here the struggle of the relatives of victims of state violence and even the work of human rights activists during the internal war. What is common to these practices of truth-telling is that they spoke truth to power in the moment of danger. And yet, they are not object of commemoration, as the final report is. I suggest that this differentiation responds to the fact that the release of the final report is perceived as the moment in the history of violence when memory becomes official and a state language to deal with the past is instituted. As produced by an official body endowed by the law with powers of truth-finding, the TRC is by definition a truth invested with symbolic capital. A third element is that in addition of having been produced by an official body, the symbolic capital of the TRC's truth derives from the fact that it is not just about the past, but fundamentally about the future. TRCs, it has been noted, become projects of nation building by means of a subtle displacement from the function of truth-making to the function of truth-telling. Seen from these perspectives, the final report embodies a normative force, an outness that emerges from both a cultural form that connects the written text, the political community, and a discourse of post-conflict nation building. The written text presupposes a literate audience comprised by citizens endowed with the cultural capital that enables them to participate in the democratic conversation. The discourse presupposes a moral agreement about the past, presents the nation as a singular historical subject, and establishes its grid of intelligibility. That is to say, the particular schemas through which we make sense of the social order. Thus, questions of the law, regimes of rights, inclusion, exclusion, discrimination, etc., become the main categories through which Peruvians are incited to think and speak of violence. Now, there are, of course, different and contested forms of relating to both the text and the discourse. It is well known that powerful sectors in post-conflict societies seek to shape the memory and discourse of violence, denouncing selectively some aspects of the Truth Commission's final reports and articulating their own narratives. This effort corresponds to their own projects of post-conflict nation building that not only leave intact their privileges, but also expands them. A liberal response to this relentless conservative attack has been to emphasize again the need of the truth as a means of bringing people to a reflective consciousness of the real situation. The assumption here is that the truth has redemptive force in itself, and that its circulation will awake a consciousness necessary to bring about social and political change and avoid the possibility of violence in the future. The notion of nunca más, never again, presupposes the idea that reading and knowing, or more precisely, knowing through reading, awakes consciousness. There are a couple of problems with this form of response. First, since all that is needed to ensure the circulation and dissemination of the truth, the response to denial resonates with doctrinal forms of relation to the text. The truth is a doctrine. Second, the truth that needs to be circulated partakes of the thought of the majority. That is, it draws from those forms of thought that unfold on the basis of given perspectives within a set of always already established set of historical and theoretical categories and presuppositions. Deleuze and Guattari say that majority is defined not by number or identity, but by a constant mode of existence that transcends its conscious plane of theoretical analysis. To participate in the discussion of the same social and historical events, and for once words to mean the same thing, it is necessary to adopt the majoritarian perspective, so that the same names and codes can be used. A majoritarian perspective refers to a state of domination, a standard in the world against which everything is to be judged. The problem is that truth-telling is always, by definition, a minoritarian function. And it is so, not only in terms of the languages of truth it mobilizes, but also in terms of the conditions of its actualization, as well as the implications for the truth-teller's life. As said before, one of the defining aspects of truth-telling is that it takes place in the moment of danger. Taussig mentions, for instance, the struggle of the mothers of the disappeared in Latin America. He speaks of, I quote, the naming by the mothers of the disappeared in public spaces of the names of the disappeared, together with their photographs in collective acts acquiring the form of a ritual in which what is important is not so much the facts, since they are in their way well known, but the shift in social location in which those facts are placed. End quote. In the moment of danger, the mother's practice of truth-telling relocate the facts of terror from the private sphere in which the state seeks to situate them to the public sphere in which the mothers place them to denounce denial and contest silence. A minoritarian mode is also apparent in the languages in which pain is presented. Again, minority is defined not by a small number, but by the variation of the collective assemblage of enunciation. In other words, it is defined not by a distinction of scale, but of composition of things and words. It is not a quantitative, but a qualitative distinction that focuses on perspective and becoming. Here, it is not about finding a pure language uncontaminated of state language, nor is it about opposing the language of sentiments to the language of rationality. It is about a different mode of composition, one that focuses not on the meaning and effects of the written text, but on the mobilization of affects in response to the threat of state violence. To illustrate my point, I'll comment briefly on a small museum built in Ayacucho, Peru, by the Quechua-speaking mothers who disappeared in memory of their missing children. I will touch on some basic elements. First, I note a particular relation between the museum's truth and the TRC's truth. This intertextuality is not determined by either outright denial or straightforward replication of the official truth, but by the museum's selective use of fragments and quotes of the TRC's final report. These have been extracted and patched in a distinctive way, telling a different story of collective suffering and struggle against state terror than the one offered by the TRC. This fragmentary use emphasizes the evidentiary aspects of the official truth, those that help the mothers to contest denial, forgetfulness, impunity, and silencing. Second, as opposed to an abstract historiography that tells the story of the nation's transcendental body wounded by the irrationality of violence, the truth of the museum presents personal biographies of pain and singular stories of suffering. domestic photos of the disappeared portraying everyday life scenes are contextualized within affective textures. Third, in this affective context, let me consider another presence of the written text in the museum as expressed by two pieces of handwriting. The first corresponds to a class notebook of a schoolboy who was kidnapped by the Peruvian military from his home in 1984, showing what could have been the work of any schoolboy in a state institution, such as the school. The notebook displays the flickering handwriting, the misspellings and grammatical errors, the playful drawings, such as Peruvian flag, of a joyful boy who is about to start his preparation to enter into adult society. All we have of him now are his class notebook and his enlarged photo ID. The second piece corresponds to an anguished message sent by a disappeared young man to his family, confirming that he is detained in a military base and asking for help. Written in a small piece of coated food paper for sugar, this written text is the last visible sign of a person who, in the threshold of life and death, managed to leave this damaging indictment against the state terror. What is the work of these two pieces of handwriting here? They certainly bear witness to the life and blood of people suddenly vanished by the state. But also they testify to the double bind of sovereignty and biopolitics in the work of the state. A technology of power, such as writing, works to produce a particular type of biopolitical body and particular types of individuals, say citizens, able to participate in the political community. And yet, the flip side of this positive power is the sovereign power over the life and death of these same individuals, which manifests itself fully when state power and the social order it sustains is challenged. One just needs to think of this schoolboy who has been initiated in the promise of citizenship by means of training him in the art of writing, and yet, as the boy begins to reclaim the promise that the highly hierarchical order sustained by the state towards the state's eventual and expeditious solution to the contradiction is to banish them from the earth without a trace. Allow me here to make a connection with the case of the 43 students from the Raúl Isidro Burgos Rural Teachers College that went missing in the Mexican state of Guerrero some weeks ago. According to official reports, I'm sure you guys are aware of this case. According to official reports, these students had traveled to the city of Iguala to hold a protest against what they considered to be discriminatory hiring and funding practices by the Mexican government. During the journey, local police intercepted them and a confrontation ensued. Details of what happened during and after the clash remain unclear, but the official investigation concluded that once the students were in custody, they were handed over to the local crime syndicate Guerreros Unidos and presumably killed. In other words, these students had also been initiated in the art of writing, and they were preparing themselves to initiate others in this art of writing so as to attain the promise of modern citizenship. And yet, as soon as they mobilize to reclaim the promise, the state feels threatened and opts for disappearing them. Some conclusions. Ayotzinapa is certainly not the only case of disappearance or recent disappearance. We would like to think that the practice of disappearance is a matter of the past in Latin America, but it is not, as attested by the dozens of thousands of people disappeared in recent years in Mexico. How to write the aftermath when obviously there is no aftermath? It is here that the distinction between truth-making and truth-telling acquires relevance. It is against the permanent possibility of state terror, as well as the modulation of truth and language to speak of such violence, that truth-telling emerges as a permanent task. There is no doubt that truth-making is necessary, but the Quechua-speaking mothers of the disappeared in Peru teach us that this task cannot be left just to the mechanical work of the text, as if violence and terror would be merely a problem of consciousness. They teach us that a response to state terror demands a permanent collective mobilization. Moreover, if they appropriate the evidentiary aspects of the official truth, it is to say something else, that the unspeakable forms of violation of the human body waged during the campaigns of state terror and waged nowadays after the campaigns of state terror, which made impossible for the disappear even the possibility of death as human experience, have gone beyond the thresholds of life and death, defining a human form of life. As such, questions of justice cannot be conceived of merely in terms of restoration of regimes of rights or the rule of law, as implied in post-conflict projects of nation building, but in terms of the more fundamental problem of restoration of criteria of what a human form of life is. In doing so, these mothers move inside and outside majoritarian forms of language and thought to arrogate voice to themselves and speak truth to power in a gesture of mourning, conceived of as a permanent movement and dislocation in relation to the state. Such is a minoritarian practice of truth-telling. Thank you.
Tlatelolco, massacre of students in Mexico, which is usually considered the starting point of the transition to democracy in Mexico. The terrible event was just mentioned, the Ayotzinapa. Ayotzinapa is the little place where the school is located in the state of Guerrero, from where all these 43 students come, no? The Ayotzinapa massacre. And also, interestingly, the recent appearance of the the report by the Truth Commission of the state of Guerrero, the same state where these things just happened, concerning what is still called in Mexico the dirty war of the 70s and 80s. Because particularly in the state of Guerrero, there was an effort by the Mexican state to disappear, kill, etc., people who oppose the regime, the pre regime, and this effort was, again, particularly located in the state of Guerrero, and much more important than any other effort by the Mexican state outside of that particular state. No? This effort to disappear and kill, etc., was led mostly by the state governor and by the military. So all these things together, more or less at the same time, make me think about the notions of memory and remembrance. Because it seems clear that we need to remember these things, no? That we need to have a memory of these massacres, of all these great violations of human rights. But once you start thinking about it, there are a few dilemmas, a few difficult elements in that process that I would just like to mention aloud to see if anybody has an idea about that. No? Again, the first thing is it's obvious. We have to remember these things. No? But why do we have to remember these things? Why it's so important to remember these things? The obvious reason, and the obvious answer, and the answer that everybody gets, is that because so these things do not happen again. No? The first basic reason is that we don't want to repeat these things from happening. No? However, the problem is, what is it that we have to remember? Do we remember the atrocity, the killings, the dismemberings, the shootings? Do we remember that this was a violation of the rule of law? Or do we remember this as a violation of the general abstract normative notion of human rights? I think this is somewhat important for where I want to go at the end of these comments, which is a defense of the idea of the rule of law. But let me get there. No? So what is it that we have to remember? In any case, leaving this point a little bit on the side, in any case, if the fact that we are remembering these things, the notion of memory, has to be understood as as part of a political process, as a political event. because there are many violations of individual rights that are just criminal violations of individual rights, and we don't remember those things, no? I mean, there are many mass murders, etc., and those things are not remembered in the same way as we remember, for example, the Tlatelolco massacre or the killing of Ayotzinapa. So there is a political element present in that. And this thing, this memory, is then becomes part of a political process that will have a political objective and a political end. No? What is this political end? What should this political end of this notion of this remembrance, of this memory is? Also, there are ways to remember these things, these terrible events, and they are not remembered in the same way all over the world. For example, I just finished recently reading a great novel by a German author, Hans Fallada. The title today of the novel is Every Man Dies Alone. It used to be translated as Alone in Berlin. And this is a great novel that remembers not the Holocaust, not the suffering of the Jews in Germany, but the suffering and the efforts of normal Germans to oppose the regime. That's a different type of remembrance, the Hitler regime, of course. That's a different type of memory of remembrance of the same event, which is what? The terrible years of Hitler. There are some times, some cases in which memory and remembrance are not that important for the construction of a better political system, of a better future. The biggest case is, of course, Spain. In Spain, both the winners and the losers of the Civil War decided to put aside most of the effort of remembering what happened, most of the memories of all the killings and terrible violations of human rights committed by both sides. And thanks to this, to a large extent thanks to this, they were able to build a very decent democratic system. So we don't always have to remember to obtain the political end that we want. No? Again, I'm just trying to complicate the notion. And of course, I am Mexican, so for us, remembering things like the massacre of Tlatelolco is still very important, because we are still trying to come up with a decent working political system that stops these things from happening. Now, there are two usual answers by NGOs, by people involved in efforts of memory and remembrance, two typical answers to these things, as I discussed. On one side, people insist that they don't want these things to happen, and on the other side, in many cases, people present demands alongside the demand that these things doesn't happen, of social justice, of changing the conditions against capitalism, etc., as part of the process of remembrance. And if you know these things, these usually happen. I have an example, I will mention later, taken from the report of the Truth Commission of CGHR, which is very, very interesting. However, if we just stay with the demand of these things should not happen again, we still have to explain how are these things not happening again. What are we going to do so these things don't happen again? No? On the other hand, if we insist in adding to the memory, to the idea that we have to remember these violations of human rights, other things such as social justice, economic justice, the betterment of the, etc., etc., what we are doing is basically proposing the political project of one part of society, no, as part of the solution of a problem that is not a problem of just one part of society, as part of a solution of a problem which is the problem of the whole society. My point with all this is that if we do these things, if we just try to keep saying, let's not happen again, it's not happen again, the fact is that they keep happening. No? And that's for me the relation between the Tlatelolco massacre and this massacre. We have two bunch of students killed in the same country 40 years apart after enormous political change. No? So these things keep happening. And that's not to mention the many other little killings, when there are not 43 but 17, 22, 12, etc., which keep happening in Mexico. And in many other parts of Latin America constantly. So it doesn't work. On the other hand, if we add other elements, what we get, again, is the political project of one sector of society, of one group of political parties. That doesn't really work. My point with all this is that the only, in my opinion, correct way to understand the correct political function of memory and remembrance is as a defense of the rule of law. Because the only thing that will stop these things from happening is the establishment of the rule of law. If you think about it, what we don't have in Latin America, and what is missing in many of the other places in the world, Cambodia, etc., where this terrible violation of human rights happen, is that they just don't have a working system of law. No? And my bafflement, if you want, is that almost no one goes to the streets and says, okay, we should remember this, we should try not to happen again. And what we have to do is to build a system of laws. No one goes out on the street with placard and says, please give me a very decent and very good police. They don't do that. And frankly, how are you going to stop these things from happening if you don't have good judges, good detectives, etc., etc., etc.? In my humble opinion, where we are now in Latin America is at this very moment, no? Where we have to stop bringing stories about the end of capitalism and dominate, etc., etc., and we have to start demanding actual construction of the institutions that will allow us, first, that will stop these things from happening, but also that will allow the regular citizens to live decently, to live without fear of being kidnapped, of being robbed, of being killed, etc., etc. This should be considered as part of the same movement, the same demand. No, the only way, in the case of Ayotzinapa today, the problem, of course, is even if the Mexican state actually explains what happens, no one is going to believe it, because there is no tradition of the state telling the truth. Or not even that, there is no tradition of the state being able to solve crimes, to solve regular, everyday crimes, much less this terrible thing. My own sense is that the state, the Mexican state, is going to explain what happened, and it's going to be the truth, and no one is going to believe it. No? So, in order to stop these things from happening, we have to start considering the notion of memory and remembrance as part of the effort of building the actual institutions that will allow us to live without these things. If you think about in those states, particularly in English-speaking world, but also in parts of Europe, where there is a strong state and a strong notion of the rule of law, these things usually don't happen. No? And for me, this is where we are right now with the notion of memory. We should we should take the next step and start demanding as citizens the construction of the institutions that will allow us to live much more. And since I don't have much time, finally, this commentary, it has to do, as I told you a moment before, with this new report of the Commission on Truth by the state of Guerrero. They had a very difficult time. They didn't get the money they were owed. Even if this was a commission appointed by the state of Guerrero, they made all sorts of difficulties, and people ended up working on their own because they were not even paid, etc., etc. So they made a great effort. And the report, I read the whole thing, is very detailed. Details a lot of the killings, a lot of who was involved, etc., etc. It was a very good report in general, with problems, because again, they didn't have a lot of money and help. However, the conclusions are very interesting, because the conclusions start with the idea that people were not allowed to dream, start with the idea that they even mentioned 9/11. to me, these things destroy the whole the whole idea of these truth commissions. What we need is just the facts, just the truth, and a demand, again, for the institutions to solve these issues, and not all these other elements that, again, are part of the usual way in which many NGOs and many people involved in memory and remembrance of these terrible issues usually behave. I think the time's up, so thank you so much.
Our next presenter is Natasha Zaretsky. She's a visiting scholar at the Center of Study in Genocide and Human Rights, where she will be a co-leader of Argentina Trial Monitor and team leader of the International Working Group on Latin America. She holds a PhD from the Princeton University. Her dissertation topic was focusing on the aftermath of political violence and genocide in Argentina, specifically the social movements and human rights groups formed to advocate for memory and justice in Buenos Aires Jewish community. Her broader research focuses on the roles of memory and truth in rebuilding communities and nations in Americas, and the impact of genocide and human rights on diaspora communities. Her publications include articles focused on politics of memory, aftermath of political violence in Buenos Aires, and she's currently finalizing her manuscript about Argentina, in addition to co-editing the volume on MIA bombing, the worst terrorist attack in the history of Argentina. She has taught courses on comparative genocide, human rights, political violence, and social changes at Rutgers and Princeton. Natasha Zaretsky will focus at CGHR her work on genocide trials currently underway in Argentina, as well as working on her documentary about memory, violence, in addition to conducting field work focused on Holocaust education and awareness in the Soviet Jewish diaspora. Her current talk today is entitled Justice in the Land of Memory, Reflections on Human Rights in Argentina. Please join me in the round of applause to Dr. Zaretsky.
The benefit of going last in this kind of roundtable is that I get to benefit from Dr. Rojas and Dr. Schettino's work, and my work also looks at memory in relation to political processes, to the formations of new democracies, and thinking about the relationship between memory and truth and justice in what I'm going to be talking about today in Argentina is important, and really thinking about how memory and justice and truth articulate with one another, and the kind of slippages, to connect to Dr. Rojas' presentation, that also exist. So my talk will be very ethnographic, based on my field work in Buenos Aires on the politics of memory. As you can see, this idea of memory, truth, justice, memoria, verdad, justicia, are pillars now. They stand as concrete entities that are literally in front of all the different sites of memory related to what used to be known as the Dirty War in Argentina and now is referred to as genocide or the dictatorship or period of state terror. So even though the talk today was about memory, silence, and witnessing, and we all talked about memory and truth in relation to justice, Argentina's government has taken these terms as literally pillars that are central to their process of democracy today. The reason why I titled my talk Justice in the Land of Memory is because Argentina has been a land of memory for many years. I'm going to call it Dirty War. The genocide ended in 1983, so 31 years ago, but the trials related to that time only started relatively recently. So for many years, Argentina existed in a state of impunity. And memory was the stand-in for the justice that was perpetually on the horizon. Now, these words, memory, truth, and justice, you can also see on the bottom of that banner, it says March 24th, 1976. So you will find these terms, memory, truth, and justice, on posters commemorating that time. So there's a lot happening on this poster. It's very symbolically dense. So March 24th, 1976, that's when the coup happened that brought in the military dictatorship that perpetrated the crimes of the Dirty War. The 30,000 disappeared in Argentina. You also see that it is now an official day of memory. It's called the Day of Memory for Truth and Justice. And on the bottom you see the nation that loses memory ceases to be a nation. You know, so this idea of what happens when memory becomes, you know, this would be a form of truth-making rather than truth-telling, where the state is literally using its memory to generate a form of power. And nunca más, what you see over here, never again. So that was the title for the Truth Commission report, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, but the Truth Commission in Argentina was one of the very first in the world and in Latin America. And today, almost every nation in Latin America has had some form of truth process, be it a commission or an opening of archives or something else. What you see here, it's hard to see it, but these are more pillars: memory, truth, justice, that now stand in front of the ESMA, the Navy School of the Mechanics. And the ESMA and what you see in front of the ESMA are one of the iconic activists in Argentina, mothers and grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, who were advocating for their children who were disappeared. So what is interesting also about this site, so this is the ESMA where many tortures and disappearances took place, and the ESMA trials are currently underway. So the Argentina Trial Monitor that the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights is undertaking is focusing on the trials that are happening as we speak about crimes at the ESMA. The ESMA is also located in the city of Buenos Aires. It is in the northern part of the city, so people, while these tortures were happening, would just be passing by the gates or going about their business while this was happening. So it's a really, really powerful symbolic space for the city because it is right in the middle of things, and this is where this terrible thing was happening. And thinking about silence and vanishing, you know, the question was asked, how can the state vanish thousands of people and nobody knows? You know, that's a very complicated question because it was happening right there. If you are a scholar of memory or an anthropologist of memory, what is also interesting is that now the ESMA, this space, is called the ex-ESMA. So you can't call it the ESMA anymore because there's been this discursive attempt to dislocate this space from the past. So this is not the ESMA, they're reappropriating this as the ex-ESMA and trying to make it a different kind of symbolic space. And they're also calling this the space of memory. So if you go into this space, I was just there in July, so it's a very chilling space in many ways. But what you will find there now is not just images of the disappeared, but you will find the organizations that were formed and the human rights groups that were formed in response to these disappearances. So now you have the offices of the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, of the hijos, the children of the disappeared. You also have an archive there called Memoria Abierta, Open Memory, that has collected testimonies about this time. So now this ESMA, this a former site of torture and disappearance, has been recreated as the ex-ESMA and the space of memory. So thinking about these pillars, you know, all the groups that are collected in this space of memory, in this ex-ESMA, are also groups that were trying to assert a truth that resisted the military and the state narrative for many years. So perhaps the best known of these human rights groups are the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, who started as a group when their children were kidnapped by the military and later tortured and killed. And these women, as you may know from reading, had little political training, but decided to stand together in the Central Plaza of Buenos Aires to resist the silence that permeated society at the time. So this is an image of the obelisk in Buenos Aires, and it's a phrase that says, "Silencio es salud," silence is health. And at the time of the dictatorship, you know, from my interviews with my informants, as we call them in anthropology, they described this as, well, this was what the state was talking about in relation to traffic. that's what they were saying, but everyone knew what they really meant at that time. So this idea of silencio es salud, that to be healthy is to be quiet, to be silent. So you have to imagine in this period of complete impunity, not impunity, I'm sorry, complete silence and negation that the state was doing anything wrong, you also have these mothers standing in the plaza declaiming that, yes, they are doing something wrong, look at us. The very term arose during the time of the dictatorship when these parents that were mothers and fathers, but the mothers for various reasons were the ones who took on more of an activist role, were going to police stations asking where their children were, and they were simply told they must have disappeared, gone without a trace, and simply vanished from being. Today we know that an estimated 30,000 people were disappeared, tortured, abused, killed, thrown from planes, all for being considered subversive, somehow threatening to the national order as defined by the military powers. But what we know today about those 30,000 disappeared, or even that number, is only because of the activism of the human rights groups that formed to resist the silence emanating from the state. Finding out what happened to them, finding the truth of what happened, and resisting the military's version of what was happening was central to their goals and objectives at the time. And this is an image of the mothers in the Plaza de Mayo. Indeed, the mothers' practice of inscribing the names of their children and the dates of their birth, wearing those headscarves on their bodies, and marching week after week in the central square of Argentina, all presented a different truth to that of the military, that these disappearances were happening and that their children did exist and that their memory would not vanish. As the scholar Marguerite Baitlowitz tells us in the Lexicon of Terror, the military also used language to suppress what was happening and to distort the truth. And in response, the truth about what happened became central to the human rights movement and to the transition to democracy in 1983 in the subsequent Truth Commission that formed, the CONADEP. Argentina, as I mentioned, was one of the very first truth commissions in the world to have formed. And when it formed, it didn't have the word reconciliation in it. That came with South Africa. But this whole idea of truth as being central to processes of transitional justice was very much at work in Argentina. In 1983, the democratically elected government of Alfonsín formed the Truth Commission as a way for Argentina as a society to come to terms with what happened. And it also presented a way to mitigate the possibility of another coup, which they feared might occur if extensive prosecutions of perpetrators took place. So the Truth Commission was certainly groundbreaking there, resulting in the collection of hundreds of testimonies and systematically establishing the patterns of torture and repression undertaken by the military dictatorship in power. It also left an important mark in the collective memory of Argentina when the report was published as a book, Nunca Más, Never Again, which became a bestseller. So my informants also told me in interviews that it was very common to be on the beaches in the summer and people reading this book on the beach as they were on vacation, which seems very, very unsettling in some ways, but it was this huge bestseller. So this, again, thinking about this not just as a text, the government report that was issued, but as having a social life, and the social life of this text is what is interesting to students of memory. Yet, despite the significance of the Truth Commission to Argentina's transition to democracy, and that truth certainly presented an important response to the silence emanating from the state, truth also stood in marked contrast to the minimal justice process that was undertaken. The newly elected democratic government held trials in 1985, prosecuting only the highest-ranking officers. There were 9 who were tried in 1985, and 5 were sentenced. Videla and Maceda to life imprisonment. General Viola received 17 years, Admiral Lambruschini 18 years, and General Orlando Agosti 4.5 years. 4 were also acquitted. So we have a brief moment of justice, and then those trials, however, lost their meaning shortly thereafter when 2 laws, the full stop law in 1986, and then the due obedience law in 1987, which essentially gave a blanket amnesty to everyone involved. And then in 1989 to 1990, President Menem pardoned those officers who were sentenced or court-martialed under these trials. So essentially, we entered the 1990 as with Argentina in a state of complete impunity, where the perpetrators were walking free, literally, on the streets. So with these amnesty laws, impunity continued in Argentina for many years, and this impunity actually is what became the fertile ground for memory and for memory movements, as well as efforts to document what happened, not from the state, but from the ground up. So you see Memoria Abierta creating an archive. You see many different human rights groups and other institutions documenting what happened and advocating for memory and trying to establish a truth that stood in place for a delayed justice. But what happened to the perpetrators? This is a colloquium about perpetrators. They continued working and being in the streets. And about 10 years after the Truth Commission report was published in 1995, we see the publication of a work called El Vuelo, The Flight, by a journalist named Horacio Verbitsky. Now, Verbitsky interviewed Adolfo Cilingo, a retired Navy officer who was a lieutenant commander, and he had personally pushed 30 people to their deaths from the death flights that he operated. And he was the first to publicly break his silence about the military's actions perpetrated during the dictatorship. So in this book, In the Flight, which is translated into English as you see, Cilingo recounted his experience throwing those who were disappeared and tortured and killed by the state into the water. Approximately 2,000 people were pushed to their deaths from planes. Some of them were drugged, not even dead, and thrown into the water. And these death flights became emblematic of the brutality of the military regime in power, and today are also memorialized in the Park of Memory. So this Park of Memory is not far from where the ESMA is. It's along the water where these death flights happened. And one of the things that were put into this Park of Memory are these different signs. And as you can see, there's a person in a plane there that's supposed to symbolize these death flights and mark this space. So thinking about what it means for a perpetrator to confess what happened to them when they're not indicted and when they're not before Truth Commission, when they aren't given amnesty. I turn to the work of Lee Payne on perpetrators in her book Unsettling Accounts, specifically in her chapter on silence, where she describes the response to Cilingo's confession in terms of President Menem's reaction to it. So Cilingo confesses to Verbitsky, this book is published, and then President Menem says, quote, "To silence Cilingo, President Menem pointedly avoided addressing the existence of death flights. He sought to silence discussion of that topic by challenging the integrity of those who evoke the past as being, quote unquote, repugnant for, quote, digging the knife into a wound that we are trying to close, unquote." So this whole idea in 1995 was that, you know, why is this guy telling his story and digging this knife into a wound that we need to close in order to move forward? So as much as we think about truth and memory essential to transitional justice and to democracy, those in power, like Menem at the time, truly believed that, or saying that he believed that this was digging a knife into the wound. So in this atmosphere of sustained impunity, new forms of advocacy were inspired to disrupt the silences that were emanating from the state. And I want to talk about the work of the ICOs, the children of the disappeared. So who are these children of the disappeared? Their parents were kidnapped and detained and disappeared, and then they were raised by other families. And so in the 90s, at that point, they were in their 20s. So they were in their 20s, some early 30s, and they were, so they were university-age students. And as young people, they had a little bit more, you know, building on the advocacy of the mothers and the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo. They were a little bit more brave to disrupt things in a different way. For example, so this is called an escrache, and this is from the year 2006. And escraches are very different from the public marches in the Plaza de Mayo, which were extremely disruptive during the time of the dictatorship. But these escraches actually go to the homes of the perpetrators to say, here lives a perpetrator. So these signs say, in 100 meters, you know, Jorge Rafael Videla Genocida, that's his address, Cabildo 639, that's his home address, that's where he lives. And so they have these huge protests where they're basically saying, you know, this silence that everyone's living in, where people can think they can go about their lives as if nothing happened, we're not going to let that happen, even if the state did. So, if you permit me, I also just want to quickly show a clip from one of these discussions so that you can
de la prisión domiciliaria, el Cabildo 639, Espíritu de asesino.
And what you saw, the spray painting there, was 30,000, companions, compañeros disappeared who are present. So this whole idea of the memory and these memory movements and these escraches actually, actually making present and resisting the silence that exists with someone like, Videla being able to live in complete impunity and comfort on Cabildo in a very nice building and move on with his life. They're trying to disrupt that. So in 2006, we're still at a time when there are some legal changes beginning to happen, but the trials are still only beginning. Moving on, during these years of flagrant impunity, the efforts of the human rights movement continued. The mothers kept on marching for all these years and continue the march. The grandmothers of the Plaza, they're a group that look for their missing grandchildren who were born in captivity and then adopted to other families. So they use DNA to try to find their grandchildren. And the hijos continued these kinds of escraches. And in Buenos Aires today, we see the Day of Memory, March 24th, as a day that is commemorated very broadly. This is a banner with all the faces of the disappeared that was part of the protests. And these are more images from the protests. We also have the Park of Memory, which is along the River Plate, which again is the site of these death flights, located on the outer borders of the city. And you see a wall of names that's very reminiscent of the Vietnam War Memorial here in the U.S. And these are names of the disappeared, and it's a monument that moves. You have to walk through it, and it moves you towards the water. And this is another sculpture that's in the water that's supposed to commemorate the disappeared. And so you see all these parks and these monuments, these spaces of memory, these sites of memory that's grappling with the tension over disappearance and presence. Again, this is another sign, 30,000 disappeared, a sign about impunity. This is a map of where all the perpetrators live. So as in the title of my talk today, Argentina has become a land of memory in many ways, where memory is a central political modality today, and cultural modality. And then you have the ex-ESMA there as well. And the mothers keep on marching. But something else has also happened recently that is different. All of this started with the presidency of Nestor Kirchner. Under his rule, we see important human rights reforms take shape, including the overturning of the amnesty laws in 2003, when Congress repealed the full stop law. Later in 2005, the Supreme Court overturned the amnesty laws, opening the gates for prosecutions to begin again. And the first trial took place in 2006, focusing on Miguel Echecolatz with an estimated 600 defendants. And what we see is that as a result of these changes, what was a land of memory is now also a place where justice is possible. But I'd like to think about this relationship between memory and justice, or have you think about it as not being a simple either or simply that they work together, but also thinking about how it was because of the lack of justice that these memory movements arose, and that there's this active urgency to remember, because without that, justice may never happen. And instead now, we have a different situation in Argentina where the ESMA is the ex-ESMA, it's an official space of memory. Memory has become an instrument of the state in many ways. So what happens to the collective memory in society at large? We're now in a historic moment in Argentina when, after decades of impunity, those responsible for the genocide are now being held accountable, and the landscape has literally changed. This is just an image from the ESMA trials that started in 2012, where in front of the ESMA you have these pillars now: memory, truth, and justice. And as the trials continue to prosecute the perpetrators, the voices of the survivors and the activists are now acknowledged by the state in new ways. That is breaking its juridical silence and impunity through these prosecutions. But as at these trials we see the delicate relationship between memory, truth, and justice, the trials themselves are also collective social events that are shaping collective memory. And so the question that will remain for future research, perhaps some of your own research, will be what impact will these new forms of justice have on social memory and the new dynamics of silence and witnessing that may follow these trials? How will justice affect the land of memory? Thank you.
So I just want to say thank you to my colleagues, and I'm proud to say friends, for sharing with you very meaningful, thoughtful, and of course scholarly reflections on an area of a part of the world that of course I have personal connections to, but I think also part of the world that is very often perceived as a sort of monolithic America, and is one of, in binary categories, as either hopeless or hopeful. And so I think it was terrific that we began with Dr. Rojas asking us to look at this critical dynamic of truth making and truth telling, or as I also like to say, I guess by Americanizing, the manufacturing of truth and the reading of truth. And as someone who at least 3 days a week this semester thinks about text and narrative as a teacher of literature and rhetoric, I think it's very important that we conceive of this as a kind of narrative. I think Dr. Schettino challenged us to examine this kind of narrative process and narrative power and ways in which the state has appropriated and ways in which we can look to processes of justice. Particularly, I think he challenged us in ways that perhaps we need to think about. And I'm extremely grateful to Natasha for, we have 2 anthropologists, a philosopher, a political scientist, and I'm commenting as someone from the world of literature, and I think that that's, again, a meaningful enterprise and an exemplary of the ways in which in Latin America it is what I would call a kind of post-disciplinary approach that we need to examine. And so Natasha, I think, brought us to, in particular in the case of Argentina, an example that has many of our friends in Latin America look to, and in particular the realities of justice, as she noted today. And Dr. Rojas talked about and had some very beautiful pictures about the context of Peru. Dr. Schettino reminded us of the 40 years ago and current realities of the massacres. But what I think is important for us to take away from Dr. Zaretsky's reminder that today, right now, there is a sense of hope in the trials that are happening. In fact, we have a reporter friend that some of us here in the audience know, who is looking forward to some verdicts that will be happening in December. So, and in terms of perpetration, I think what we see once again is that the notion of perpetration, the concept of the perpetrator in Latin America, I propose to you, is something that can never be binary, and that can never be a binary proposition on our part. And so, again, it's something for us to think about. I'd like to turn it over to our wonderful young people here, our students of the future. So, guys, ask away. Don't be shy. Yes.
So I'm struck by the 3 cases presented, and in Peru, we're looking at rural victims versus the very urban victims of Argentina, and in Mexico, it's almost the duality of both. Today it was somewhat more rural, but the massacres of the students in the 80s was very much urban. So yes, excuse me. Good. So I'm wondering if if that may play a role in how it's used in these narratives and building of democracy, et cetera. So I realize that's a really broad question for all three of you, but
Do you guys want to take it? Each one of you address it. Okay.
Are we taking more questions or just?
No, I think we'll answer.
Okay.
We'll answer, and yeah. So why don't we?
I will say that in the case of Argentina, Buenos Aires is a city that has almost a monopoly on the national imaginary in Argentina. So even though it's one city, it is a very dense place as far as where the producers of culture and meaning originate. And many of the disappeared were students, so I did mention that point, but many of those who were disappeared were students, were historians, were psychoanalysts, were anybody who was involved in something that could be considered as subversive, which might be having the wrong book on your bookshelf. There are many different ways of understanding it. So I think that question of these state disappearances that we're not targeting a certain sector that might that was not elite. These were also targeting the elites in many cases. So I think, that rural-urban question, within the context of Argentina and its history is a little different than it would be in Peru.
Yes, I think that I totally agree with you. I think that we need to pay attention to these, differences, rural, urban, ethnicity, class, etc., to map the trajectories of memory and justice in order to avoid, making a sort of, blanket, assertions. In the Peruvian case, for instance, one crucial thing, and that's one of the things I wanted to address in my paper, most of the victims of violence were illiterate. They just didn't speak even Spanish. And the justice institutions, the truth commission itself, everything is in Spanish. So how is it that we are going to, claim for the rule of law or whatever, when you have population that, it's not, proficient in the language of the state. So there is something that you need to, interrogate in that very distinction in terms of finding forms of agency that are working within and outside, the state institutions. That was, the entire attempt of my paper.
Yeah, well, in the case of Mexico, there has been terrible violence in the rural violence forever, for the existence of the country, and it didn't really matter. What happened in Tlatelolco was in downtown Mexico, close to downtown Mexico City, and then it mattered. I don't like the Zapatistas. I was never a friend of the Zapatistas in any way, but the fact is that they did put in the map the plight of the rural poor and how bad the conditions were. No? So in that extent, you remember Zapatistas was an uprising started in 1994. Ever since the problems there, the problems in rural sections of Mexico are much more important. No? Now, this massacre in Ayotzinapa happened in a city, in a very small city, but it was a city. No? It's possible that things like this happen much more often outside of the cities, and frankly, nobody cares. I mean, basically, and nobody knows. Also, and I will finish with that, because the Mexican press is very bad, so it's very difficult to gain information. If you are not there, or if you are not really interested.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It's such an interesting topic for me personally. And I think throughout the presentations we've heard that we have to remember these atrocities so they will not happen again in the future. And also I think it was emphasized that, memory focuses on the victims' voices, their suffering, their personal stories. In Dr. Hinton's class, we've been studying more about perpetration itself and perpetrators and what makes them commit, such acts. So, what do you think about including perpetrators' perspective in the memory in terms of using that as a future prevention of such acts?
So in my case, I talked about Adolfo Cilingo and The Flight, which was this groundbreaking book because he was not compelled by a truth commission. He was not compelled by a court. He came forward himself because he felt like he wanted to confess and tell his story. And I certainly recommend Lee Payne's book, Unsettling Accounts, because it goes through different perpetrators' accounts. But it's interesting because it certainly didn't open the floodgates for many other perpetrators to come forward, because even though at the time there was a blanket amnesty, that's been overturned. So, the question of how the medium in which the perpetrator's account comes forward also shapes that account and that narrative, and thinking about what it means to include those voices and what are they telling and what does it mean. So in South Africa we have a different case of where many perpetrators do have their accounts registered because of the amnesty that they received in exchange for their accounts, but what does that actually mean for understanding reconciliation on the ground in terms of relationships among people? So that I think that the question of what kind of accounts from perpetrators the Argentina would be ready to receive outside of a trial, I'm not sure what it would be.
I'd like to comment on that because I'll use the example of the case of Colombia. I think it's very challenging, and I would interrogate this kind of enterprise because, and I've heard it before, I think it's an important, I'm glad that you asked that question, particularly because it's the kind of thematic of the colloquium, right? In a case like Colombia, how does one define this perpetrator narrative if you have citizens who, because of the context of a place like Colombia, can be found to at times be both victim and perpetrator? So,
and it's not the state necessarily
right,
which is committing this crime, no?
It's not necessarily
people outside of the state.
And they're they're non-state actors. And sort of what does that, what do we mean when we're asking for for the inclusion, for the examination, for the exploration of these kinds of texts or narratives or stories? And I would, Natasha, I think is right. Where do we situate those in the context of a larger project of memory or remembrance? And what Humberto and I often discuss this, what sometimes in Colombia we will say the kind of futility, if you will, of the notion of prevention.
I also just wanted to add quickly that, in understanding the role of narrative or testimony for victims in terms of healing, rebuilding social ties, what it means for perpetrators, however you define that term, is very different because when they're compelled to give their testimony in a public forum, if they were to tell their testimony and their truth, whatever that is, what they might tell is that, we believed in this mission, in this military mission, and that's what we felt we needed to do. So if they are then in a public forum where they know that won't be accepted, the question of authenticity and, that slippage between public and private spaces, and what it means to tell in a public space versus a private space, I think is also really important.
Yeah, and often, if you've examined, in the case of Colombia, if you examine accounts, there are often 2 or potentially 3 accounts of the accounts that literally are in conflict or competing with each other.
That kind of leads into my question. It was, is there a difference in practicing memory if the atrocities are perpetrated by the state upon its own people, or civilians against each other, different groups perpetrating atrocities against each other? How is the practice of memory and truth-telling different in those two?
I'm not sure, but let me see. I mean, there is. I have problems with certain definitions of the state. We tend to think that the state is merely, the apparatus. I mean, the bureaucracy and the armed forces and institutions and whoever has done some little bit more work on theoretical work on the state, has a more complex picture of the state, right? I was tempted to say, in my presentation that, of course, counterinsurgency campaign happened in very specific ways during the Cold War era, in which we had the armed forces involved in these massive violations of human rights, the police, etc., etc. And it seems to me that forms of counterinsurgency, are still happening nowadays, in spite of the fact that these institutions are not, directly involved in this violence. I mean, the state might be killing by proxy. So using these irregular groups, etc., it's still a state, in spite of the fact that we don't have these institutions there. So it seems to me that the first thing that we need to do, and you guys are starting with your research project, it's to complicate some of these notions that are taken for granted, like the state and outside the state, and or even memory, or I was going to in this idea of complicating notions, taking for granted ideas, just to remember that the Spanish case usually is presented as one successful case in which they didn't have to go through this whole process of addressing past violence and just forget decided to forget the entire thing. Well, right now we have hundreds of exhumations of mass graves that are taking place in Spain right now, as we speak. So it seems that memory is never entirely buried. So the dead are coming back to reclaim some political at least discussion or conversation about the ways in which the political community is constructed. So again, I would start. I guess this is because I am an anthropologist, and in anthropology always we have been asked to first to interrogate our taken for granted ideas, and I would strongly also ask you guys to do the same, right?
I just wanted to add to that. I think it's a really great question, because this idea of it being the state and everything else is a really important opposition or differentiation to unpack and to problematize, because during the military dictatorship, even though the perpetrators were in the military, the silence in society perpetuated that violence. So that question of how do you complicate this idea of perpetrator? So not to say that the person walking getting their groceries is the same as the person torturing, but that silence allowed that violence to continue. I mean, I interviewed people who said it was only when I went on a business trip to London that someone said, how could you live in Argentina with all this torture happening? So he truly didn't even know everything that was happening in his own country until he left. So this idea, I mean, they had the World Cup there, in the middle of the dictatorship, so you had the whole world going there and paying attention. So, this whole notion that, the state just operates on its own, I think is not right. And I think for the people I work with, what's important to them is that, thinking about what will all of this justice mean. So these are people who lost their children, their family members, during this time. They've been waiting for justice for decades. So now suddenly you have these ESMA trials, you have all these trials happening, but what will happen to the memory of their children, when these trials end? Because then suddenly, it's over, it's done, we got what we wanted, we have this justice. So that question of these practices of memory, even whether or not the state is involved, what matters to them is that the memory, that their children don't truly disappear and vanish, which is what would happen without the memory of them. So, part of what I was trying to think about in my talk is, now that we do have this justice, what will happen to the landscape of memory? So I think it's a great question.
Yeah, can I say something? Yeah, I guess in the case of Mexico, the question is very important, because there have been many massacres in recent years that have been committed by drug lords, by gangs. The problem there is that the state is not doing the job. No? In some cases, they are accomplices of these gangs, but the ones organizing the stuff and the ones giving the order are drug cartels, violent gangs, etc. How are we going to deal with those things? They are obviously criminal acts, but as you probably remember, there were 80 Central Americans killed in Tamaulipas 3 or 4 years ago. And soldiers were not involved, the police was not involved. I mean, of course, they should have been trying to stop that, but that was not something done by any members of the state. It was completely done by gangs. It is not absolutely completely clear now how are we going to deal with that and how are we going to remember those things. No?
So the concept of remembrance and rule of law, I'd like to hear some of your thoughts on the Rios Montt trial and the effect that it has on law, the whole appeal and trial.
I was, thinking precisely in presenting one example about this, that tells the tons about, this connection between legal justice, and I emphasize legal justice, the justice that is, done through legal institutions, and the question of justice. I want to follow what Natasha was saying before. In 2005, for the first time, there was a case of forced disappearance of one student in Lima. This was one of the few cases that happened in Lima. A student was kidnapped from a major, private university, and then he was taken, away by the police, and he basically disappeared. So the family was, engaged a long struggle in terms of trying to get, justice done, and the case went even to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. So it's a whole, process that took years after years after years. The kidnapping happened in 1991. So the case was finally brought into the courts, or before the courts, in 2005, and ended with, the conviction of the direct perpetrators, of those, of policemen who was proven took away, this student. By the way, the body never reappeared. So it was a sentence. In that sense, there was a sense that legal justice had been done. But at the very end of the sentence, the father said something like, "Well, this is okay, but my son, where is my son?" So in spite of the fact that perpetrators are prosecuted and sentenced and sent to jail, etc., there is something that still is it's there. It's not complete. So justice is done in certain respects, but it's not entirely attained. And of course, the father continues to not only mobilizing in solidarity with other victims, but he's still he's still in search of the body of his missing son in terms of giving him proper burial. So there is again, this idea of inside and outside should be taken seriously. There are things that happen within institutions. Of course, nobody's saying, well, that we don't need courts. Or there are things that have to be done within institutions. But it would be a mistake to say that that's it. That's all that we can do, and then we are going to move on. There is this outside aspect that needs to be also considered, and I think that's what's working precisely in what Natasha was presenting here, right? And this force is what we need to look at.
Thank you for your presentation. Just one question in as far as memory and establishing policy. Here in the States, they're addressing violence throughout the country as a public health concern. What insight does state violence in Latin America offer to violence here in the States? And does the state addressing violence in this country as a public health concern, does it absolve them of any accountability? As far as if the state addresses it as public health concern, does it remove them from being responsible or influential in the
again, that's what makes it important. If it were just criminal gangs, it would be a different thing. No? In many of these cases, there's a political element to this violence. Here in the States, it is not so clear. No, You can, maybe Ferguson might be an example, but that doesn't seem to be the same case, no? In the case of Mexico, this political violence was never very ideological, if you want. In the case of South America, it was much more ideological, but I think there's a clear distinction between the two types of violence, no? Even though there's still a lot of violence in the state, no? But it seems to be a different type.
It was part of your question what the United States can learn from Latin America. Okay, so I think one of the interesting things that I remember a couple of years ago when Occupy Wall Street started this movement with so many friends, why are they out on the streets? What's happening? And I said, well, this happens all the time in Latin America. I don't know why it's so surprising here. So I think that question of how citizenship in Argentina, at least where I did my research, is a very embodied practice. It's something that you do with your physical body, where you go out into the streets and we're literally disrupting physical spaces is central to disrupting the narrative of the state. That without your physical presence and that act and those practices, you're not going to make the kind of changes that you want. So certainly we have that history here with the civil rights movement, with many other movements, but that question of today, how I think that complicating our understanding of citizenship is one of the things that I would say.
So just to highlight the collective aspect of the response, of the mobilization, right? That's something that is also crucial, to emphasize in this kind of situations.
Thank you.
Thank you all for the excellent presentations. I have kind of a general question. I was wondering how international law and international norm setting influences or not and enables or constrains. What is the role that sort of international language and law plays into mobilizing memory, both just the general project and then also in trying to hold people to account for what has occurred? So if you think of the word genocide, for instance, that's very much a project of international law and emerged on the international scene first and foremost. How do then people internalize that? Do they internalize it? How do they do it? How does it play into the whole system, I suppose?
As I mentioned in my talk, I used the word dirty war because when I was in graduate school, that's what I learned. In reading the work of historians and others, in English, what happened in Argentina was addressed as the dirty war. But my informants tell me in the human rights community, no, you can't use that word anymore. Can't say dirty war. And I'm saying in English, exactly, because that's the language of the state. So now we call it genocide or state terrorism, or you could say dictadura, proceso, because it was called the process of national reorganization by the state. You could still kind of say proceso, but dirty war you cannot use anymore. So, and I think in using the word genocide, that's been a very deliberate way for the human rights community to not only realign the way we understand what happened, but to also think about the implications, the juridical implications that that word brings to holding the state to account. So I think they're very much thinking about, how the language that we use and these discursive frameworks carry legal implications beyond the boundaries of Argentina, but also there's a social component to it. So it's not just about what they use in the trials and language. They want people on the ground to start using these words because they understand very clearly how language is this space for power. So the same way that the military in power in the 70s and into the 80s, used language as a way of perpetuating their power, the human rights community is also very aware of the need for language in civil society at large to also resist certain silences and certain forms of impunity. So we definitely see how these international norms are being appropriated, for specific meanings there.
I would just also add that it's what I think is remarkable is also it's the expansion with the localization and navigating that relationship. And Natasha spoke about social project, and I would also extend it to the educational project, because in places, and I'm thinking particularly of Peru and Argentina, where you're beginning to see the educational spaces like ours. There's a bridge so that this is not something that just happens in a courtroom, but is happening in the classrooms. And kind of to connect back to Michael, I would say another lesson learned is that educational spaces are not some kind of, in between or quiet ignored spaces in Latin America. These are spaces of resistance. These are spaces in which the politics of the language are interrogated, are played out, and I think that's an important lesson learned, if you will.
Can I just piggyback on that for 1 second? So in Argentina, one of the institutes I was affiliated with was the IDES, which has a Núcleo de Estudios de Memoria, led by the sociologist Elizabeth Jolene. And her work, she had the SSRC, she was the director of a project where scholars in all the different countries in Latin America wrote about political repression, and we're working on it. So it's not just, I happen to be from the US going to Argentina, but there is a very rich scholarship there and in many other countries in Latin America that is documenting and chronicling and analyzing these processes, and that's another very important part of the resistance to it.
My question is about the South Africa experience, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I would want to get your thoughts on how that whole experience is viewed in Latin America. It was, very controversial, but to be that way, and how it is viewed, whether it's a model, whether some lessons learned from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
I think each of you should address that. These are important questions, so we'll start with you and we'll go back.
Okay, the South African experience, in Latin America, the idea, I might be wrong, but the idea I have is that it's Latin America that inspired the South Africa. It's not the other way around. As Natasha was saying, the Truth Commission, the Argentinian Truth Commission was one of the first ones. And then after that came, two truth commissions, the Chilean one, which, by the way, was the first to use the name Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Right. So that was the Chilean, and around that time was also the Salvadorian Truth Commission. So the experience of truth commissions actually, started in full in Latin America, and only afterwards, it traveled to South Africa. That added its own components. This question of amnesty for perpetrators, for instance, was a South African creation, and of course it was controversial. And then afterwards, they're having several other mutations according to the political context. The Peruvian one started in 2001 and ended in 2003. And it incorporated, some of the previous experiences. For instance, the use of public hearings, for victims. That was not used before by the Chilean or the Argentinian truth commissions, less by the Salvadorian, not even the Guatemalan. So it's a sort of, a new. Some scholars, have conceptualized this entire question of truth commissions as a sort of new industry in the area of human rights, transitional justice. We have not only already developing a sort of a specific language, a language of experts, a closed language, but also there are already some institutions. In New York we have the International Center for Transitional Justice, a center for experts who travel all over the world, bringing the expertise, to teach the local, initiatives how to do their truth commissions or their process of transitional justice. So it's another, aspect of our global reality, and I think, in themselves, these experiences, along with, for instance, the intervention of the international legal systems, are not, negative in themselves or nothing like that. The question is how we pay attention to the ways in which, as Natasha was saying, people appropriate, on the ground and develop their own, uses and their own languages in response to these global, interventions or global influences. I think in that sense, these global institutions or global languages and practices are in one way enabling, but in another way might be controlling. So we need to take care or to be aware of the controlling aspect of these interventions.
Thank you for your question. I think it's a great question. I haven't been to South Africa or done research there, but when I teach, I use the work of Martha Manel, Between Vengeance and Forgiveness. And what's interesting about that account is thinking about what happens when you can't have justice in a traditional sense. Bracketing the question of like the very heterogeneous way of understanding justice. But here in South Africa, you see how, that model of the Truth Commission also took on local meaning. So this idea of Ubuntu, of, somehow reconciling and restoring something that was broken as being more important than retributive justice, which is a more Western understanding of justice, more of a restorative justice. And I think that's really important how, that process in South Africa introduced that idea of restoration to the Truth Commission model. Of note is that in Argentina, which the Truth Commission there predated the South African one, but the idea of the Truth Commission was not to reconcile society, which was the idea in South Africa. It was to prevent another military coup, because the coup in 1976 was part of decades of coups in Argentina. There are many military dictatorships. This was not the only one. So it had a very different social meaning to have that Truth Commission. And even today, these processes of justice, they're not entirely, I don't know how much it's influenced in the case of Argentina, what's happening now, because there isn't this desire to reconcile with the perpetrators. There isn't this desire for society to come together. So, and it raises other questions, because there are other silences that are happening. So all the people in Argentina who for years said, oh, por algo será. They must have taken these people because they did something. What's happening to them? Do they suddenly turn around and say, oh, no, now we understand, that these were victims and the state did this? It's not always clear, because now in the public sphere, there is no space for their voices and for that kind of dialogue. So what's actually happening in civil society in the sense of healing or restoration is still an open question, but the society moves forward in democracy. I mean, more of a pressing question in Argentina today are questions of structural violence, of inequalities and poverty and other things that are very disruptive to the society, and those are other kinds of silences that exist as well.
I really have nothing to add.
I do want to comment on the structural violence component, because it's something that we have. I think that in, if you will, in the lexicon of Latin America and how we think of Latin America, it's something that is often not discussed. And for me, I'm very interested in also in non-Western ways of exploring these issues, and I look at the Cambodian model, in which there were multiple issues that included looking at structural violence, and included silences and spaces that had never even been addressed until the moment in which this kind of hybridity, and even the very idea of hybridity was not until, it wasn't until later in which large groups of rural peoples came to Phnom Penh that these concepts were even interrogated. So I think it's important to I go back to problematize and to rethink how we're we're defining these concepts, and to really destabilize notions that we often not only destabilize those notions, but ask ourselves, why are we vested in that very particular notion, that particular definition, in that particular context.